The candlelight flickered against the stone walls of El Palacio de la Sombra, a fortress so old that its foundations whispered secrets in Latin. Princess Isabella of Habsburg was born on a night when the moon refused to rise. The midwife, pale and trembling, swaddled the infant in velvet and whispered, "She bears the mark." Isabella's jaw was already pronounced, her lower lip jutting forward like a challenge to the world. Her eyes, though a soft grey like ash after a fire. The court physician scribbled notes in a leather-bound ledger, noting the curvature of her spine and the stiffness in her limbs. "A child of noble blood," he wrote, "and of noble burden." Her mother, Queen Mariana of Austria, watched from her bed, her face unreadable. She had married her uncle, King Philip IV, as tradition demanded. Her womb had become a battleground for dynastic purity. Isabella was her third daughter, and the only one to survive past infancy. She played with dolls dressed in miniature court gowns, each stitched with the family crest, a lion devouring its own tail. In the nursery, portraits of ancestors lined the walls, each with the same jaw, the same hollow eyes. Isabella would grow up beneath their gaze, learning to curtsy before ghosts. By age 5, she could recite the names of her cousins, who were also her uncles. But Isabella preferred the stories of stars. How they burned quietly, far from the reach of kings. At night, Elena, her lady-in-waiting, would read to her from the Book of Saints. One evening, as fog rolled in from the hills, Isabella asked, "Why do we marry our blood?" Elena hesitated. "To keep the crown from strangers." "But what if the crown is cursed?" Isabella whispered. Outside, the fog thickened. Inside, the bloodline endured. The bells of Vienna rang not in celebration, but in resignation. Mariana of Austria, just 14, stood beneath a vaulted ceiling painted with angels who seemed to look away. Her wedding gown was heavy embroidered with gold thread and stitched by hands she'd never meet. She was marrying her uncle, King Philip IV of Spain, a man twice her age and thrice her sorrow. Mariana lay still, staring at the canopy above, where cherubs danced in painted joy. She dined in silence, walked in silence, prayed in silence. Her ladies-in-waiting dressed her in layers of silk and lace, each one a reminder of the role she must play. She was queen now, but not free. There, she found a book on astronomy. She traced the constellations with her finger, imagining stars that burned far from the reach of kings. She felt nothing. Not pain, not pleasure, only the weight of expectation pressing into her chest. "You should rest, your majesty," she whispered. The ceremony was grand, but the silence between them was louder. "Then perhaps they are wiser than we." Philip's eyes were tired, his jaw stiff with the Habsburg mark. Her diary would become her only confidant, her only rebellion. In ink and silence, she would record the unraveling of a dynasty. Mariana curtsied, lips trembling, and offered her hand. He kissed it like one might kiss a relic, reverent, distant, and cold. The court whispered behind fans. A union of blood, they said. A marriage of necessity. But Mariana knew it was a cage. Her dowry was not gold or land, it was her womb, her lineage, her ability to bear heirs who would carry the same twisted jaw and fragile bones. Their wedding night was a ritual. The bed was blessed by priests, the sheets inspected by madrons. In the weeks that followed, she learned the rhythm of palace life. Philip rarely spoke. When he did, it was of politics, treaties, and the need for a male heir. Mariana nodded, smiled, and swallowed her fear. She was young, but not naive. She had seen portraits of her husband's previous wives, pale, solemn, and gone too soon. One evening, she wandered into the royal library, where dust clung to forgotten tomes. Elena, her new lady-in-waiting, found her there. Mariana looked up. "Do stars marry their own light?" Elena blinked. "No, my queen. They burn alone." Mariana closed the book. Outside, the moon rose wan and watchful. Inside, Mariana began to write. Elena had served queens before, but none like Mariana. The young monarch moved through the palace like a shadow stitched to silk, graceful, silent, and always watching. At night, when the wind curled through the corridors, Elena swore she heard murmurs, soft voices that didn't belong to the living. She dismissed them at first. Old stones settle, drafts wander, but then she began to notice patterns. It was a physician's journal, dated decades earlier. The entries were clinical, detached. Elena had learned to read the language of sighs, the meaning behind a glance, the weight of a pause. Difficulty feeding, third miscarriage, suspect uterine malformation. mental dullness observed in air, no improvement. Their eyes followed you, their jaws jutted forward, their expressions were unreadable. Elena often lingered there, studying the faces. Some looked eerily alike generations apart, yet nearly identical. The same chin, the same hollow gaze, and lately, the palace itself seemed to speak. These were not isolated cases. She knelt and prayed not for salvation, but for clarity. And in the silence, she heard it again, a whisper. She was no longer just a servant. She was a witness, not from the heavens, but from the stones beneath her knees. A mirror, a mistake. There were patterns, echoes, of a bloodline folding in on itself. The walls of El Palacio de la Sombra were ancient, layered with tapestries and secrets. In the nursery, portraits of royal daughters hung in solemn rows. One morning, while dusting the library, she found a forgotten ledger tucked behind a shelf. She recorded the stiffness in Isabella's gait, the tremor in Mariana's hands, the pallor of the younger maids. She wrote of dreams of corridors that led nowhere, of voices calling her name in Latin, infant born with mandibular. Elena's hands trembled. She began to keep her own notes, hidden beneath her mattress. One evening, as she passed the Queen's chamber, she heard Mariana whispering not to a person, but to the walls. "I am not a queen," Mariana said. "I am a vessel." Elena paused, heart pounding. She wanted to comfort her, but the words felt too heavy to lift. Later that night, she wandered into the chapel. Candles flickered, statues loomed. "The blood remembers," it said. Elena rose slowly. By the time Isabella turned 12, her jaw had become the subject of whispers. Courtiers spoke in coded language, noble profile, distinguished chin, but the meaning was clear. He scribbled notes in Latin, never meeting her eyes. Mandibular prognathism, he muttered once, unaware that Isabella had begun translating medical texts in secret. Their painted mouths hung open, unable to close. Isabella studied them, wondering if they had also struggled to chew, to speak, to be understood. Her underbite had deepened, her speech slowed, and her smile became something she practiced only in solitude. But no one taught her how to answer the question that lingered in every gaze. "What are you becoming?" She paused before a painting of Queen Mariana, her mother, whose jaw was less pronounced but whose eyes held the same quiet sorrow. The palace physician examined her monthly, measuring the angle of a mandible with brass calipers. She knew the word. She knew its weight. At court banquets, she sat beside portraits of ancestors whose jaws jutted like cliffs. Charles V, Philip IV, Charles II. Her tutors taught her diplomacy, theology, and astronomy. "They say, beauty is a gift," she said softly. One afternoon, she wandered into the portrait gallery. The air smelled of varnish and dust, because it was chosen for us, not by God, but by blood. Elena joined her, carrying a tray of tea. She imagined the bones beneath her skin, how they had been shaped, not by nature, but by generations of marriages that folded the family tree into itself. Isabella turned. "Then why does ours feel like a curse?" Elena hesitated. Inside, Isabella began to dream not of crowns, but of freedom. Later that night, Isabella stood before her mirror, tracing the curve of her jaw with trembling fingers. She opened her diary and wrote, "I am the echo of 1,000 choices I did not make. My jaw is not mine, it is theirs." Outside, the wind howled through the palace corridors. The diary was bound in green leather, its edges worn from years of trembling hands. Mariana kept it beneath her pillow, wrapped in a silk scarf embroidered with stars. No one knew it existed, not the king, not the priests, not even Elena. It was her sanctuary, her confessional, her only truth. "I bore his children, I watched them die." The way her own body felt like a vessel carved from glass. She wrote of dreams of running through fields without corsets, of speaking without consequence, of marrying for love. She wrote at night, when the palace slept and the candles burned low. Her words were not regal, they were raw. "I married my uncle." The ink bled slightly on the page, as if the parchment itself wept. She feared for Isabella, whose jaw had begun to mirror her father's. She feared for herself, as her body grew weaker with each passing year. Mariana chronicled everything. The stiffness in Isabella's limbs, the silence of her stillborn sons. She had once believed in duty. Now she believed in survival. It read, it was written in a hurried scrawl. "The blood is folding in on itself," she wrote. "We are becoming echoes." She described the court's obsession with lineage, how portraits were studied like medical charts, One entry was different. She feared discovery, not for treason, but for truth. Charles is born. He does not cry. He could not nurse. Mariana held him and whispered prayers, but the silence between them was louder than any hymn. Charles II, her son, had arrived with the weight of centuries in his bones. His jaw was severe, his tongue swollen. She began to hide her diary in different places beneath floorboards, inside hollowed books, behind tapestries. One day, Elena found a scrap of parchment tucked inside a candlestick. "We are cursed by ourselves. We are not cursed by witches." Elena said nothing. She folded the note and placed it back where she found it. She understood now. The queen was not mad. She was awake. Outside, the bells rang for mass. Inside, Mariana dipped her quill once more. "If I cannot change the blood, I will change the story." The whispers began in the kitchens. "The king is bewitched," said a scullery maid, her hands deep in flour. "His tongue is too large, his eyes too dull." Charles II, the heir, was growing but not thriving. He did not speak until he was 4. He did not walk until he was 8. His jaw jutted forward like a cliff, and his eyes wandered as if searching for a world beyond this one. In the chapel, the priests prayed harder. Candles burned longer. Incense thickened the air like fog. But no miracle came. The court began to murmur, not of politics, but of curses. Some blamed witches, others blamed Mariana. She married her uncle, they said. She defied nature. The queen heard them, though they never spoke to her directly. She read it in their eyes, in the way they crossed themselves when she passed. "The blood has folded too many times," he whispered. "He cannot breathe." Elena, ever watchful, began collecting the rumors. She wrote them in her hidden journal. "The boy is cursed. The blood is poisoned. The crown is cracking." One night, a monk arrived from Toledo. He claimed to have visions. He said the royal line was tainted not by sin, but by repetition. Mariana summoned him in secret. He spoke of recessive traits, of invisible chains passed from mother to son, from cousin to cousin. "I cannot find the soul," he said. Inside, the crown grew heavier. He did not use the word inbreeding. He called it the echo of pride. "You sought to keep the crown pure," he said. "But purity is a myth, and myths demand sacrifice." Mariana dismissed him, but his words lingered. In the portrait gallery, new paintings arrived. Charles II sat for one, his jaw exaggerated, his eyes vacant. The artist wept as he painted. The painting was hung beside Philip IV, whose own jaw had passed down like a curse. Visitors stared. Children cried. The servants began to avoid the gallery altogether. Elena found Mariana there one evening, staring at the canvas. "Do you believe in curses?" the queen asked. Elena hesitated. "I believe in choices and consequences." Mariana nodded. "Then we are cursed by both." Outside, the bells tolled for a feast day. Charles II was born into silence. He did not cry. He did not move. The midwives exchanged glances, their hands trembling. Mariana of Austria, his mother, lay pale and still, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as if searching for stars that had long since vanished. The court physician wrote in his ledger, "Mandibular prognathism, muscular hypertonia, prognosis uncertain." The boy's jaw jutted forward, his tongue swollen. His limbs were limp, his skin waxen. She had read the journals, the ledgers, the hidden notes. Charles was not cursed by magic. He was cursed by blood. He was baptized within hours. His meals were soft into paste. His tutors trained to repeat lessons slowly, gently, endlessly. Mariana held the power, but her grip was slipping. Factions formed. Nobles plotted. Foreign ambassadors sent coded letters describing the boy king as fragile, unfit, a shadow, not out of celebration, but fear. As Charles grew, the palace adjusted to his stillness. He did not speak until he was 4. He did not walk until he was 8. The artist had tried to soften the features, but the truth bled through the canvas. The bells rang less often. The courtiers aged. The portraits gathered dust. The courtiers called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. Rumors swirled like incense, that witches had cursed him, that Mariana had summoned spirits, that the crown itself was poisoned. No heir, no legacy. Only a name etched in marble and a dynasty folded into history. She wrote in her journal. But Elena knew the truth. The bloodline is spent. The crown waits for a stranger. The family tree was no longer a tree, it was a spiral, folding inward, collapsing. He married twice, once to a French princess, once to a German one. Neither union produced an heir. He is more inbred than a child of siblings, one physician whispered. Inside, the silence remained. His father, Philip IV, had married his niece. His grandparents were also cousins. Charles's reign began at age 4, with regents ruling in his name. In the portrait gallery, a new painting was hung. Charles sat stiffly, his jaw exaggerated, his eyes vacant. Mariana wept when she saw it. "He is my son," she said, "and my undoing." Charles tried to rule. He signed decrees with trembling hands. He attended mass, his lips barely moving. The palace grew quiet. Elena, now gray-haired, watched from the shadows. The throne is hollow. And so it did. In 1700, Charles II died. Outside, the fog lifted for the first time in years. The apothecary's shop sat at the edge of the city, nestled between a crumbling chapel and a vine-strung lead wall. Elena had passed it many times, never thinking to enter. Bottles lined the shelves, each labeled in looping script. The apothecary was an old woman with eyes like polished stone. This was written by a physician who served the Habsburgs before they were Habsburgs. The physician had observed that children born of distant unions were stronger, healthier, more resilient. He had urged the crown to marry outside its borders, to seek alliances not just of power, but of vitality. He warned of the blood's folding. He proposed a remedy. She did not ask Elena's name. She simply said, "You've come for the truth." But now, with Charles II fading and Mariana growing weaker by the day, she felt drawn to its quiet promise. Inside, the air was thick with herbs, lavender, valerian, dried rose hips. Elena hesitated. "I've come for a cure." The woman nodded and reached beneath the counter. She produced a scroll, yellowed, brittle, sealed with wax. Elena unrolled the scroll. It spoke of genetic dilution, a concept centuries ahead of its time. "The blood must breathe," he wrote. "It must wander." Inside, the apothecary's secret took root. The scroll also described herbal treatments, tonics to strengthen the womb, powders to ease deformities, tinctures to calm the mind. None were cures, but they were hope. She returned to the palace and slipped it into Mariana's tea. The queen drank, unaware. That night, she slept without pain for the first time in months. Elena asked, "Why was this never used?" She whispered its contents to midwives, to maids, to anyone who would listen. The apothecary sighed, because it required change, and change is the one thing a crown fears most. Elena purchased the scroll and a small vial of amber liquid. Isabella, too, received a dose hidden in her ink, absorbed through her fingers. She began to dream again, of stars, of freedom. Elena knew it was not enough. The bloodline was too far gone, but she also knew that stories could outlive She copied the scroll by hand, hiding copies in libraries, monasteries, and beneath chapel stones. "Let the blood wander," she said. "Let it breathe." Outside, the fog began to lift. The painter arrived in silence. His name was Matteo della Rosa, a man of modest fame and meticulous brushwork. He had painted saints, martyrs, and merchant spot. When summoned to El Palacio de la Sombra, he brought only his oils, his canvas, and a quiet dread. Matteo studied her features, the curve of her chin, the shadow beneath her cheekbones, the way her lips parted slightly, as if unsure whether to speak or breathe. He was to paint Isabella. She sat beneath a window veiled in lace, her jaw stiff, her eyes unreadable. "Make me beautiful," she said, the quiet defiance. They wanted portraits that whispered of grace, not of genes. But Matteo had seen the scrolls, the ledgers, the faces that repeated across generations. He knew the truth. The deformities were not accidents, they were inheritance. Then let them see. Matteo hesitated. "I will make you true." The court expected flattery. He began with charcoal, sketching the outline of her face. Each stroke revealed more than Bornet, revealed history. The Habsburg jaw, the hollow gaze. Isabella watched him work. He captured Mariana's weary eyes, Charles's vacant stare, the subtle asymmetry in the younger maids. He painted not just faces, but legacies. They spoke of a dynasty undone not by war, but by its own reflection. "I think you are a mirror. Do you think I am cursed?" Matteo paused. "Then they will bury them, and one day someone will dig them up." He left the palace without ceremony, his name forgotten, his art sealed in stone. She nodded. In the weeks that followed, Matteo painted in secret. One night, Elena found him in the gallery, staring at his finished work. "They will never hang these," she said. Matteo smiled. He wrapped the canvases in linen and hid them behind the chapel walls. Years later, a fire swept through El Palacio de la Sombra. The portraits were found smoke-stained, haunting, honest. Historians called them the last portraits. Outside, the fog returned. Inside, the truth waited in oil and silence. The palace was quiet. Charles II had died without an heir. His body, frail and twisted by centuries of inbreeding, was laid to rest beneath the marble floor of the royal chapel. The bells tolled, not in mourning, but in relief. The line had ended. The crown would pass to strangers. Elena stood in the gallery, now empty of courtiers and echoing with dust. She held her journal worn, ink-stained, and filled with truths no historian had dared to write. Isabella, Mariana Shahulis, all frozen in oil and silence. Their eyes stared forward, but their stories had been buried beneath ceremony and myth. She had watched queens marry their uncles, daughters inherit deformities, and kings crumble under the weight of their own blood. "We thought purity would preserve us," she wrote, "but it only made us fragile." The palace crumbled, the portraits faded, but the journal survived. The portraits remained. Elena packed her journal into a satchel lined with velvet. She left the palace through a servant's gate, walking into a world that no longer bowed to the Habsburg name. She traveled to a monastery in the hills, where she entrusted the journal to a scribe who promised to copy it, preserve it, and hide it until the world was ready. Years passed. It was found centuries later, tucked inside a hollowed book in a forgotten library. Scholars read it with trembling hands. Inside, the truth had finally spoken. They spoke of bloodlines, deformities, and the quiet courage of a woman who had witnessed the fall. The end of the line, Elena had written, is not the end of the story. Outside, the fog had lifted. The archive was not listed on any palace ledger. It lay beneath the west wing, behind a rusted iron grate and a wall of forgotten wine barrels. Elena had heard whisper servants spoke of a room where names were buried, where truth was folded like parchment and sealed with wax. She found it on a moonless night, guided by a draught that smelled of ink and mildew. The door creaked open to reveal shelves of scrolls, ledgers, and maps, each one older than memory. A single candle flickered in the corner, illuminating a desk carved with the Habsburg crest. He gestured to a map yellowed, sprawling, and marked with red ink. It was not a map of land, it was a map of blood. At the desk sat the archivist. She found one labeled of Castilla royal daughter who had vanished from records. The archivist handed her a scroll. Another, Isabella, daughter of Mariana, betrothed to her cousin. The map showed marriages, not as unions, but as loops died, suffocating, endless. He was thin, cloaked in velvet, with spectacles that magnified his eyes into moons. He did not speak. She was sent to a convent at age 3. Her name was erased. Lines crisscrossed like veins. Circles overlapped. Names repeated. Elena traced one path. Mariana of Austria, niece and wife to Philip IV. Inside was a list of names, those who had escaped the bloodline, who had married beyond the cage. Elena tucked it into her journal. She found notes from physicians, midwives, even painters. One entry read, "This is the true kingdom," the archivist whispered. "Not of land, but of lineage." Elena studied the margins. Some names were crossed out, others were circled in black. She realized the archive was not just a record, it was a graveyard. "Luque was born with a twisted spine and a cleft palate," he said. Elena's hands trembled. She spent hours copying the map, memorizing the loops, the omissions, the truths. The jaw grows stronger with each union. The mind grows weaker. Before she left, the archivist gave her a final gift, a sealed envelope marked for the end. "Let the blood wander," she whispered. Outside, the palace slept. Inside, the map pulsed with memory. The ledger was bound in cracked leather, its pages brittle and ink. Elena found it tucked behind a false panel in the archivist's chamber, sealed with a wax crest that had long since faded. It bore noted only a symbol, a jawbone crossed with a quill. Inside, the writing was dense, clinical, and coded. "Female, born with mandibular prognathism, difficulty nursing, speech delayed. Deceased at 2 years." The physician who authored it had served 3 generations of Habsburgs, and his observations were meticulous. Each entry began with initials, followed by a series of symbols: a crown, a cradle, a skull. Elena spent days decoding the symbols. A crown meant royalty, a cradle marked birth, a skull signified death. Some entries bore all three. Female, conceived by uncle and niece, born with fused vertebrae, hidden from court, name erased. The physician had tracked deformities across generations, noting how each union tightened the spiral of decline. He wrote of miscarriages, stillbirths, and children sent to convents under false names. The crown is cracking. They will not listen. Mac, severe hypotonia, unable to walk, mental dullness. The physician had tried to warn them. In one margin, he wrote, "Rain began at 4, no issue." The ledger was not just a medical record, it was a confession. The ledger became legend passed in whispers, stitched into hems, hidden in hymns. But it was math. It was marrow. One entry chilled Elena. Inside, the blood ledger waited, its final pages blank, ready for the next name. IV. She realized the ledger was a mirror to the archivist's mapper biological blueprint of dynastic collapse. The blood is folding. Elena copied the entries into her journal, careful to preserve the symbols. She knew the ledger could never be published, but it could be remembered. She shared it with the apothecary, who wept as she read. They thought deformity was divine punishment, she said. Elena began to teach the symbols to the younger maids, embedding the truth in lullabies and embroidery. Outside, the bells rang for a royal christening. Her name was Catalina of Austria, though few dared speak it. She had been born 2 years before Mariana, with the same pale eyes and the same noble blood. But unlike her sister, Catalina had been born with a twisted spine and a cleft palate, the midwives whispered. The priests frowned. The court scribes recorded her birth, then struck it from the ledger. At age 5, she was sent to a convent in Toledo. Officially, she had taken vows. Unofficially, she had been buried alive. I remember, and I am coming home. Mariana remembered her only in fragmenta, lullaby hummed in secret, a doll with a missing arm, a voice that echoed in dreams. She had been told Catalina died of fever, but one night, Elena found a letter tucked inside a hollowed book in the archive. The guards hesitated. She showed them a ring and heirloom once worn by their mother. They let her pass. To my sister, I live. She had kept records, names, dates, symptoms. She had built her own archive, hidden in hymnals, and stitched into altar cloths. The letter was dated 3 weeks prior. Catalina arrived at the palace gates in a plain cloak, her back hunched, her face half hidden by a veil. The sisters stared at each other, decades of silence pressing between them. Mariana met her in the chapel. "They said you were dead," Mariana whispered. She wanted the ledger rewritten. Catalina smiled, crooked and quiet. "They needed me to be." She spoke of the convent, of the other daughters sent there, girls with twisted limbs, clouded minds, and royal blood. "We were the cost," she said, "the price of purity." Mariana wept. Elena listened. The palace trembled. Catalina demanded nothing. She did not want a title, a chamber, or a crown. She wanted truth. She wanted her name restored. "Let history remember me," she said, not as a mistake, but as a warning. Outside, the bells rang for Inside, the sisters sat side by side, one crowned, one erased, both daughters of a dynasty that had folded in on itself. Her name was Agnes del Sol, and she had delivered more royal children than any priest had baptized. She wore her years like armor wrinkles etched by candlelight, hands calloused from cradling both life and death. For 40 years, she had served the Habsburg court, summoned in silence, dismissed without thanks. Agnes felt the weight of her silence pressing against her ribs. She had taken an oath to serve the crown, to speak no truth, to bury what must be buried. But now, with Mariana fading and Charles II barely clinging to life, Elena found her in the infirmary, tending to a maid with a fever. The room smelled of time and regret. "You were there," Elena said. "For the births, for the ones they never named." Agnes didn't flinch. She simply nodded. "I held them," she whispered. "I watched them breathe once, then never again." She had wrapped them in linen, kissed their foreheads, and handed them to priests, who carried them to unmarked graves. Tomás, Beatrice, children who had never worn crowns, but bore their weight. She spoke of daughters born with fused limbs, sons with no eyes, infants who never cried. "They called it God's will," she said. but it was blood. It was math. Agnes opened a wooden box beneath her cot. Inside were scraps of cloth, each embroidered with a name, a date, a symbol, her own ledger, her own rebellion. "I stitched what they erased," she said, "so they would not be forgotten." Elena traced the names with trembling fingers. They feared what she might become. Agnes handed her a final scrap one stitched in gold thread. "This one," she said, "was born with a perfect heart." But they feared her jaw. They feared her mind. Elena folded the cloth and placed it in her journal. "You broke your oath," she said. Agnes smiled. "No, I rewrote it." Outside, the bells rang for a royal feast. Inside, the midwife stitched memory into silence. The invitations were written in gold ink, sealed with wax, and delivered by footmen in crimson livery. The palace had not hosted a ball in years, not since Charles II's health had begun to fail. She wanted to remind the world that the crown still glittered, even if the blood beneath it had begun to rust. But now, under flickering chandeliers and velvet drapes, the court would dance again. It was Mariana's idea. The ballroom shimmered with mirrors and music. Nobles arrived in masks, lace, feathers, porcelain. Each face was a mystery, each smile a performance. Isabella wore a silver mask shaped like a crescent moon. Elena, dressed as a maid, moved through the crowd unnoticed. She had arrived with a forged seal and a quiet fury. Her presence was a whisper of rebellion, a reminder of the daughters erased. But beneath the laughter, something stirred. Catalina, Mariana's forgotten sister, stood at the edge of the room in a simple black mask. She had not been invited. Copies hung in secret chambers, passed between scholars and servants. One was tucked behind a tapestry in the ballroom, a painting of Isabella, unmasked, her jaw severe, her eyes defiant. Agnes, the midwife, watched from the gallery. She recognized faces she had once cradled as infants, now grown, masked, and hollow. Inside, the masked ball became legend, not for its splendor, but for the moment the masks came off. Mariana nodded. She clutched a scrap of embroidered cloth in her pocket, a name never spoken aloud. Matteo's stolen portraits had begun to circulate. Elena found it and smiled. Mariana stood at the top of the grand staircase, her mask removed. Her face was pale, her eyes tired. "Let them dance," she whispered. "The truth is already here." As midnight approached, the music slowed. "Tonight," she said, "we celebrate not our power, but our memory." The crowd fell silent. Catalina stepped forward, removed her mask, and bowed. The nobles gasped. "Let history see us," she said. "All of us." Outside, the fog curled around the palace like a forgotten vow. The chamber was cold, lit only by a single lantern swaying from a hook. Beneath it lay the body of Infanta Beatrice, a royal daughter who had lived just 6 days. Not for ceremony. For truth, her death had been recorded as natural, her name barely whispered beyond the nursery walls. But Dr. Matteo Alvar, a scholar of anatomy and quiet dissenter of court tradition, had been granted rare permission to study her remains. Her spine curved unnaturally, and her heart was smaller than it should have been. He wore gloves stitched from lambskin and a robe that smelled of His tools were simple: scalpel, quill, parchment. As he made the first incision, he murmured a prayer not to saints, but to silence. The child's bones were fragile, her skull misshapen, her jaw jutted forward. Even in death, mandibular prognathism, he wrote, thoracic compression, cranial asymmetry. He had seen these traits before in portraits, in ledgers, in whispers, but never so clearly, never so quietly. Dr. Alvar turned to his assistant, a young apprentice named Lucien, whose hands trembled as he held the lantern. "Only if the crown dares to marry the unknown." "This is not divine punishment," Alvar said. "This is inheritance." He opened a second scroll, one he had copied from the blood ledger. It matched the deformities, the lineage, the loop. 9 generations, he whispered. 9 repetitions. Lucien asked, "Can it be stopped?" Inside, the anatomy lesson waited, quiet, clinical, and damning. Alvar paused. He preserved the bones in glass, labeled them with initials, and sealed them in a cabinet beneath the chapel. He wrote a final note. "Let this be the last lesson. Let this be the last child." Outside, the palace prepared for another christening. Her name was Nuria, and she had lived in the nursery wing longer than most royals had lived in the palace. She was small, stooped, and always smelled faintly of lavender and starch. Children trusted her. Queens ignored her. But Noria remembered everything. She had spoon-fed Isabella when her jaw made chewing impossible. She had whispered lullabies to infants who would never speak, never walk, never wear crowns. She had rocked Charles II in her arms when he was too weak to lift his own head. "They are born with silence in their bones," she once said, "and it grows louder with age." Elena found her in the nursery one evening, folding linens that no child would use again. The room was quiet, the cribs empty. Only portraits remained, painted faces with hollow eyes and twisted jaws. She spoke of madness that bloomed like bruises, of princes who screamed at mirrors, of daughters who forgot their own names. She described the way deformities crept in slowly, generation by generation, like ivy on stone. "You've seen them all," Elena said. "The soul, the sleep. Tell me what the records won't." Nuria nodded. "Of Prince Tomas, who could recite Latin but forgot how to breathe when frightened. Of Queen Mariana, who once asked Nuria if her womb had betrayed her. It wasn't just the jaw," she whispered, "it was the mind." She told of Infanta Clara, who believed she was a bird and leapt from a balcony. She knew these stories would never appear in ledgers or sermons, but they mattered. They were the truth behind the tapestries. They were not cursed, Nuria said. They were repeated. Elena wrote down every word. Before Elena left, Nuria handed her a bundle of cloth embroidered with symbols, initials, and dates. "These are the ones they forgot," she said, "but I did not." Outside, the palace prepared for another christening. Inside, the nurse whispered history into linen. She arrived in a carriage of blue velvet, her crest unfamiliar, her accent lilting like wind through olive trees. Princess of Savoy, daughter of a distant Italian duke, was not of Habsburg blood. The court, desperate, turned outward for the first time in centuries. She had grown up in sunlit gardens, not shadowed corridors. Her jaw was smooth, her eyes clear. She walked with grace, not stiffness. The courtiers stared, the scribes whispered, the physicians took notes. She was chosen not for lineage, but for necessity. She is what we should have been, Elena thought. Charles II had failed to produce an heir. His body, twisted by generations of inbreeding, could no longer bear the weight of expectation. Was young, vibrant, and unafraid. She studied posture, her laughter, her ease. It was foreign. It was freedom. She visited the infirmary, spoke to the maids, asked questions no queen had ever asked, became queen in name, but not in bond. "She is not one of us," they said. "She is our breath," Elena replied. Inside, the dynasty held its breath. "She will dilute the line." The king remained silent. Mariana watched her with quiet envy. She saw in a mirror uncracked her version of herself, untouched by dynastic decay. Isabella, too, felt the shift. But not everyone welcomed her. The priests frowned. She lacks divine blood. The nobles scoffed. When she finished, she wept not for herself, but for the daughters buried in silence. She learned the rituals, wore the gowns, bowed to portraits of ancestors she did not resemble. "Why do they all look the same?" she asked Elena. She spoke of deformities, of madness, of a crown built on repetition. She begged them never to marry within. She begged them to remember. Helena handed her the blood ledger. "Read in silence." She began to write letters home to her sisters, to her father. Her marriage to Charles was ceremonial. He could not consummate. He could barely speak. Still, her presence changed the palace. The portraits seemed dimmer, the fog less thick, the silence less complete. "She is not our blood," Mariana said. Outside, the bells rang for a foreign queen. The coronation was meant to be a spectacle. Silks had been imported from Venice, candles from Cologne. Musicians rehearsed for weeks, tuning lutes and viols to echo through the marble halls. The crown itself, gold, heavy, and encrusted with bloodline, gems, was polished until it gleamed like a lie. But the boy who was to wear it could not stand. His legs buckled, his eyes rolled back. The physicians rushed in, whispering of nervous affliction and ancestral fatigue. The crown was placed beside him, not upon him. She clutched Elena's hand, her fingers trembling. Prince Philippe, Charles II's distant cousin and the last viable heir, had been chosen not for strength, but for proximity. His lineage was tangled but intact. His jaw was less pronounced. His mind, however, wandered. On the morning of the ceremony, Philippe collapsed in the antechamber. The nobles waited. The priests prayed. The scribes hesitated. Mariana, now a ghost of her former self, watched from the gallery. "It's happening," she whispered. "The blood is rejecting the throne." Elena nodded. She had seen it coming in the ledger, in the nursery, in the portrait. The dynasty was folding inward, unable to bear its own weight. The ceremony continued in fragments. The crown was lifted, then lowered. The oaths were spoken, then forgotten. Philippe was declared king, but no one cheered. Outside, the people gathered in silence. They had heard the rumors, they had seen the portraits, they knew the crown was broken. The nobles began to whisper of foreign alliances, of new blood, of escape. Inside, the palace dimmed. The chandeliers flickered. Elena wrote in her journal, "The crown is no longer a symbol. It is a warning." That night, the crown was locked in a glass case. Philippe was confined to his chambers. The Habsburg name still echoed through the halls, but it no longer commanded reverence, only pity. The chapel was dark, lit only by moonlight filtering through stained glass. The bells had not rung. The priests had not gathered. There was no procession, no choir, no crown, only a child, and a name no one would speak aloud, her limbs strong, her cry sharp and defiant. Elena held her first, wrapped in linen, stitched with stars. She was born to Isabella, not in the palace, but in a quiet chamber near the apothecary's garden. Her jaw was smooth. The child's father was a foreign scholar, distant, brilliant, and uninvited to the bloodline. Their union had been secret, their love forbidden. "She is whole," Isabella whispered. "She is not theirs." The court knew nothing. The birth had been hidden, the records falsified, but the child was free. The priest was old, blind in one eye, and loyal only to truth. Elena arranged the baptism, not in the royal chapel, but in a stone church nestled between vineyards. "What name shall she bear?" he asked. Isabella hesitated, then spoke. It was the name of Mariana's erased sister, the name of a girl buried by silence, the name of rebellion. Inside, the curse was broken if only for one soul. The priest poured water over S' brow. He did not ask for lineage. He did not trace crests. He simply said, "She is blessed. She is new." Outside, the wind stirred the vines. Elena kept watch. The apothecary brewed tonics. The nurse stitched symbols into black. The midwife smiled. Isabella returned to the palace with hidden beneath her cloak. "She will not be repeated," Agnes said. "She will be remembered." Luque grew in secret strong, curious, unburdened. She did not bow to portraits. She did not wear the crown, but she carried the story, and one day she would tell it. The room had no windows. Its walls were lined with mirror-stall, narrow, gilded in gold leaf, and tarnished at the edges. Some were cracked, others fogged with age. The floor was marble, veined like bone. No one entered the mirror room unless summoned, and Isabella had summoned herself. Her face multiplied tenfold, 20-fold each angle revealing a different truth. Her jaw, pronounced, her eyes, weary, her posture, regal and resigned. She stood at the center, surrounded by reflections. "This is what they see," she whispered. "This is what they made." In one mirror, she saw Mariana young, hopeful, doomed. In another, Charles II vacantized, crowned in silence. In the farthest mirror, she saw her daughter, unburdened and unbowed. She turned slowly, watching her image shift. Beneath the glass, she saw not herself, but a tapestry of faces. Catalina, Clara, Beatrice, Lucia and Dora's erased. Daughters remembered. Elena entered quietly, carrying a candle. Its flame danced across the glass, casting shadows that looked like ancestors. "Do you see them?" Isabella asked. Elena nodded. "They never left." Isabella approached the largest mirror, one carved with vines and lions. She touched its surface. It was cold. "They folded the blood," Isabella said, "but they could not fold the soul." Each flame revealed a new face, a new story, a new echo. She removed her crown. It clinked against the marble like a dropped coin. She placed it at the base of the mirror. "Let it reflect truth," she said, "not tradition." Elena stepped beside her. Together, they lit candles around the room. Inside, the mirror room shimmered not with vanity, but with memory. Outside, the fog pressed against the palace walls. Her name was Cecilia del Sol, daughter of the palace apothecary, and heir to a tradition older than the crown itself. She had grown up among herbs and scrolls, learning to read symptoms in breath and bitterness. While nobles studied bloodlines, Cecilia studied blood. She was 17 when she first entered the Royal Infirmary. The physicians scoffed. "She is not trained," they said. "She is not sanctioned." But Cecilia carried a vial of amber tonic that eased Mariana's tremors in a single night. The Queen summoned her again. Elena watched with quiet hope. She saw in Cecilia what the dynasty had long forgotten: curiosity without fear, healing without hierarchy. Cecilia began to catalogue the palace's ailments not in Latin, but in plain language. She wrote of twisted jaws, swollen tongues, brittle bones. She traced symptoms across generations, linking them not to sin, but to structure. She taught the maids to make salves, the scribes to read symptoms, the midwives to trust instinct over ritual. "The blood folds," she wrote, "but the body remembers." She challenged the physicians. She questioned the priests. She brewed tonics that soothed minds and softened limbs. One evening, she found Elena's journal. Inside, the apothecary's daughter rewrote the story. She read it in silence, then added her own entry. "I am not royal. I am not cursed. I am the daughter of healing." Cecilia began to teach in secret beneath the chapel, beside the garden, within the nursery. Her students were servants, scribes, even nobles who dared to listen. She stitched knowledge into tapestries, hid recipes in hymenals, whispered truths into lullabies. Mariana called her La Luz, delight. Isabella entrusted to her care. And when the crown finally cracked, it was Cecilia who gathered the pieces not to restore them, but to study them. Outside, the fog began to lift. The ink was brown, faded by time and tears. The parchment smelled of lavender and dust. Mariana had written a letter in the final weeks of her life, when her hands trembled and her voice had grown thin. She did not dictate it. She did not seal it with royal wax. She folded it herself, tucked it into a velvet pouch, and placed it beneath Isabella's pillow. Isabella found it on a morning when the fog clung to the windows and the bells rang without joy. She confessed to knowing the blood was folding, the lineage fraying, the crown cracking. She had watched Isabella grow beneath the weight of expectation, and she had wept in secret. She unfolded the letter slowly. "To my daughter, you were born beneath a moonless sky, and I feared the darkness would claim you." She urged Isabella to raise her, not as a princess, but as a person. But she lit the palace with questions no one dared ask. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply walked to the mirror room, placed the letter beside the crown, and lit a candle. "You saw ghosts in portraits and truth in mirrors. You are not a mistake. You are the echo of my rebellion." Mariana wrote of her regrets not of marriage, but of silence. "I tried to protect you with tradition. I should have protected you with truth." Inside, the Queen's final words burned quietly. She spoke of the child born free. She called her the breath we never had. Let her run. Let her question. Let her choose. Mariana ended the letter with a line stitched from memory. "We are not cursed by witches. We are cursed by repetition. Break the loop." Isabella folded the letter and placed it in her journal. Outside, the fog began to lift. He was known only as Silvano, a courier by trade, a ghost by reputation. He moved through cities with a satchel of scrolls and a heart full of secrets. Each canvas bore the weight of centuries. Twisted jaws, vacant eyes, fragile limbs. They were not royal portraits. They were warnings. His latest commission was unlike any other: to retrieve and smuggle the forbidden. Portraits of the Habsburg daughters' paintings that revealed not beauty, but truth. The portraits, if revealed, could rewrite the legacy of a dynasty that had collapsed under its own blood. Her eyes were wide, her jaw severe, her hands folded in unnatural stillness. Silvano rolled the canvas carefully, whispering a prayer. Matteo della Rosa works had been hidden behind chapel walls, beneath floorboards, inside hollowed altars. A third was hung in a secret chamber beneath the Louvre, where scholars gathered in candlelight to study the faces that history had tried to forget. Silvano had been hired by a scholar in Vienna, one who believed that art could speak louder than legend. The brushstrokes were bold, the colors muted. It was not a portrait of royalty. It was a portrait of resistance. He smuggled them in crates marked as wine, stitched them into tapestries, disguised them as religious icons. He crossed borders under moonlight, bribed guards with silence, and delivered the truth to libraries, monasteries, and hidden galleries. He began in the palace crypt, where a painting of Infanta Clara lay wrapped in velvet. He never returned to the palace, but his legacy lingered in oil, in silence, in the eyes of those who finally saw. Next, he found Isabella's final portrait, hidden behind a mirror in the nursery. It showed her unmasked, unbowed, her gaze defiant. Each painting he retrieved told a story the crown had buried. One canvas made its way to a university in Prague, another to a convent in Lisbon. "They are not cursed," one scholar said. "They are repeated." Silvano never signed his name. Outside, the fog curled around the city. Inside, the portraits breathed. The fire began in the west wing, a candle left burning, a curtain to dry, a wind too eager. Within minutes, smoke curled through the corridors, licking at tapestries and swallowing whispers. The palace guards shouted. The bells rang, but the flames moved faster than memory. Its shelves bowed under the weight of centuries. Scrolls from Toledo, ledgers from Vienna, portraits wrapped in linen, and at its heart, the blood ledger, the archivist's map, Mariana's letters. Elena was in the archive when she smelled the charred ink, scorched vellum, the death of history. She ran toward the library, heart pounding, journal clutched to her chest. She filled her satchel with fragments, a name embroidered in gold, a drawing of a jawline, a note from Catalina. She tore down a tapestry hiding a portrait of and wrapped it around the satchel. The library of El Palacio della Sombra was ancient, but Elena knew the real treasure had nearly been lost. They were burning. She saw the flames devouring the genealogy scrolls, curling the edges of Matteo's sketches, blackening the margins of truth. Elena burst through the doors. Smoke stung her eyes. She did not scream. She moved. She grabbed what she could, scraps of parchment, stitched cloth, sealed envelopes. Scholars spoke of the fire that nearly buried the truth, but they also spoke of the woman who saved it. The ceiling groaned. A beam cracked. The fire roared. Elena turned to leave but paused. On the desk lay a single book, untouched. It was the original blood ledger, its cover scorched but intact. She reached for it, fingers blistering, and tucked it beneath her cloak. Outside, the courtyard was chaos. Servants wept. Nobles fled. The crown was carried in a velvet box, untouched by flame. Together, they laid the salvaged pages on the stone table. They dried them with herbs. They copied what they could. They whispered what they remembered. She found Cecilia in the apothecary's garden. "But we are not parchment," Cecilia replied. "We are ink. The fire tried to erase us." Elena said. The library of ashes became legend. Outside, the palace smoldered. Inside, the story survived. The child's name was, and he did not belong. He was born in a villa beyond the Pyrenees, where the air smelled of rosemary and rebellion. His mother Dua was a distant cousin of the Habsburgs, so distant that her blood had long since wandered. His father was a scholar from Florence, a man with no crest, no claim, and no interest in crowns. His features were familiar, but not cursed. His eyes were sharp, his speech clear, his gait steady. He was what the Habsburgs might have been had. They let the blood breathe, yet bore the jaw. The priests frowned. The scribes sharpened their quills, not the twisted, judding mark of the dynasty, but a soft echo. Rumors reached the palace. "A child with a Habsburg chin," they whispered, "but born of no marriage, no sanction, no crown." He knew of Charles II, of Mariana, of Isabella. He had read the blood ledger. He had seen the portraits she found in a garden, tracing constellations in the dirt. He looked up and asked, "Do stars have names before they're born?" They had married freely, lived simply, and watched the dynasty collapse from afar. The nobles panicked. Elena heard the whispers and traveled in secret to the villa. She smiled. Only the ones that burned Elena spoke with, who revealed the truth. Her family had fled the court generations ago, choosing exile over repetition. But scholars did. His name appeared in footnotes, in margins, in whispered lectures. "We kept the name," S said, "but not the curse." The child who could have saved the crown had been taught history and art as glory, but as warning. She placed it beside the final portrait of Charles II. The contrast was stark, one twisted by tradition, one freed by distance. "I am not their heir," he said. "I am their echo." Elena returned to the palace with a sketch of face the court never acknowledged. The stranger's heir, they called him. Outside, the fog curled around the mountains. Inside, the story shifted. The summons arrived at dawn. A scroll sealed in crimson wax, delivered by a guard who would not meet Elena's eyes. It bore the crest of the Council of Legacy, a tribunal formed in the final days of the Habsburg dynasty to investigate historical integrity. The council consisted of nobles, priests, and scholars. They wore robes of black and gold, and spoke in tones polished by centuries of denial. In truth, it was a last attempt to control the narrative. It was worn, ink-stained, and filled with names the council had long buried. Elena was to appear in the hall of Ikosa chamber lined with portraits, each one watching, each one judging. She was asked one question: "Do you deny that you recorded and preserved forbidden knowledge?" Elena did not flinch. She opened her satchel and placed a journal on the table. "They called it dangerous. I do not deny it," she said. "I remember," the council murmured. One priest stood. "You speak of deformities, madness, and incest. You accuse the crown of poisoning its own blood." Witnesses were summoned: Agnes the midwife, Nuria the nurse, Cecilia the apothecary's daughter. Each spoke softly, but clearly. Each broke the silence. Elena nodded. "I do not accuse. They presented evidence. Fragments of the blood ledger, sketches of the Habsburg jaw, letters from Mariana. They called it treason. They called it heresy. Elena called it history. Inside, the trial of silence echoed through empty halls. "You fear truth," she said, "because it cannot be crowned." The trial lasted 3 days. On the final day, the council voted. Her journal was confiscated, her portrait removed. But she had prepared for this. The verdict was sealed. Elena was not imprisoned. She was not exiled. She was erased. Her name was struck from the palace records. Copies of her writings had already been smuggled by Silvano, by scholars, by servants who believed. The truth had already escaped. "You can silence me," Elena said, "but you cannot silence memory." Outside, the bells rang for a new monarch. The proposal arrived in a velvet box. Inside was a ring, gold, heavy, carved with the crest of House von Thalberg, a minor noble line from the Austrian frontier. The suitor, Count Elias, was distant in blood, but close in ambition. He was healthy, articulate, and untouched by the Habsburg spiral. His jaw was smooth, his mind sharp, his lineage clean. He promised heirs, alliances, and a name that could outlive the ruins of her own. But he also demanded obedience. The marriage would be public. The child, if born, would be claimed by the crown. The council called it salvation. A union of renewal, they said. A dilution of decay, Elena whispered. Isabella read the letter in silence. Elias offered not love, but legacy. "You will be queen," he wrote, "but not mother." Isabella walked the palace gardens, the fog curling around her like a question. She thought of Mariana's final letter, of his secret baptism, of the portraits hidden in ash. She summoned Elias. He bowed, he smiled, he spoke of duty. He arrived in a carriage of silver and silence. "You are the last thread," he said. "We must weave a new tapestry." Isabella disappeared from court, her name whispered only in lullabies and legends. Isabella studied his face. It was handsome, it was hollow. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Elias paused. "Then the crown dies with you." She returned to the mirror room. She placed the ring beside the crown. She lit a candle. She wrote a letter not to Elias, but to "I chose freedom," she wrote, "not for me, for you." The marriage never happened. The council panicked. The nobles scattered. The crown was placed in a vault, but grew. Outside, the bells rang for a new republic. Inside, the last marriage was never made, and the story began again. The procession was silent. No trumpets, no banners, no crown. Only candles, hundreds of them carried by servants, scholars, and daughters whose names had never graced a ledger. The palace courtyard had been cleared of marble statues and royal crests. In their place stood a single stone altar, carved with no symbols, no titles, just space. With Elena gone and Mariana buried, she stood alone but not forgotten. She wore no gown, no jewels, only a cloak stitched with names. It was Isabella's idea. She had returned from exile not to reclaim power, but to reclaim memory. Lucia, Clara, Beatriz, and Thomas, and Catalina. The names echoed through the courtyard as each candle was placed on the altar. Matteo's portraits were hung along the wall's faces, unflattered, unmasked, unforgotten. Cecilia read from the blood ledger not the clinical entries, but the stories behind them. But the people came, maids, scribes, healers, and children. They carried scraps of parchment, fragments of song, pieces of history once buried. It was no longer a symbol of power. It was an artifact of consequence. She spoke of infants who lived for hours, of daughters sent to convents, of sons who never spoke. They were not failures, she said. There were warnings, there were truths. Agnes, the midwife, placed a bundle of embroidered cloth beside the candles. Nuria, the nurse, whispered lullabies. The nobles did not attend. The priests watched from a distance. Isabella stepped forward. We were taught to forget, she said. But forgetting is a choice. And today, we choose remembrance. She lit the final candle and placed the crown beside it, not on her head, but on the altar. The bells rang not for coronation, but for closure. Outside, the fog lifted. Inside, the names burned bright. The palace stood empty. Its halls echoed with footsteps that no longer fell. The chandeliers hung like frozen stars. The portraits, those that survived the fire, watched in silence. The crown remained locked in its glass case, untouched, unclaimed, irrelevant. Time had passed. The palace had become a museum open to the public, curated by scholars, haunted by memory. The monarchy had dissolved. The republic had risen. The names once whispered in reverence were now studied in classrooms, debated in salons, painted in shadows. Elena's journal was displayed beneath glass, its pages turned weakly by gloved hands. Cecilia's tonics were preserved in amber vials. Matteo's portraits hung in a quiet gallery labeled Truth in Oil. Agnes's embroidered cloths were stitched into a tapestry called The Forgotten Lineage. Some wept, some scoffed. Some understood, grown and unbowed, visited once a year. She walked the mirror room, lit a candle, and read Mariana's final letter aloud. She did not wear a crown. She did not bow. She simply remembered. We are not cursed, she said. We are consequences. Visitors came from across the world. They stared at the portraits, traced the family tree, whispered about the blood that folded inward. The palace was no longer a seat of power. It was a gilded cage, beautiful, hollow, and filled with echoes. Outside, the fog had lifted. Inside, the story remained.